Right, the first thing I need to do is apologise if anybody is a little bit squeamish, because the first bit of this is all about the pains of purgatory and the torments that were before people in the afterlife. We have a 12th century legend called the Purgatory of St Patrick, and this refers to Loch Derg, and it describes an Irish knight, Owen, and it describes what he saw when he went into the purgatory of Loch Derg. And he says, purgatory is an infernal pit, a vast gulf, dark and emitting an intolerable stench, and full of screaming and howling, and by the pit was a serpent of infinite magnitude, bound by a great chain. Before the mouth of the serpent, he's here on my left, stood a multitude of souls, which he sucked in like flies as each breath, and then, with the return of respiration, blew them out, scorched to sparks, and this process continued till the souls were purged of their sins. And this is the doctrine of purgatory, and we have a whole series of these accounts, of visitor accounts of people who visited purgatory, and they have been very, very neatly put together in this absolutely wonderful book that you should really all should read, Eamon Duffy, The Stripping of the Altars, and he summarizes them better than I could ever do. So I'm just going to quote from him here. The prognosis for sinners which emerged from these works was, to put it mildly, not encouraging. Visitors to purgatory saw souls in every posture of physical torment, suspended by meat hooks driven through jaws, tongue, or sexual organs, frozen into ice, boiling in vats of liquid metal or fire, and all being fried like fish in hot oil. Often the punishment was carefully matched to the crime. The sexually promiscuous were tormented in the loins, the gluttonous forced to drink scalding venom or nauseous filth. The backbiters and liars had their tongues or lips sliced away. So this is the kind of stuff that people in the Middle Ages are going around with in their heads. This is the doctrine of purgatory, that basically that after death, your soul enters this kind of liminal place between heaven and hell, where for a prolonged period, and in some cases for an eternity, it's purged of the accumulated sins of a lifetime. At the end of that process, and in some cases it never ends apparently, you achieve a state of grace and you ascend to salvation in heaven. And there was no questioning of this whatsoever in the medieval mind. This is what dominated medieval belief systems from the late 13th century up until the Reformation, and as I'll be describing later, it went on a bit longer in Ireland. It dominated medieval belief systems, and it dominated the medieval cult of death. So, because this stuff is going around in your head, and you're walking around and you're starting to creak a little bit, and you're starting to think about the end, and you're thinking about maybe I should make my will and all the rest of it. You want to do everything that you possibly can do to lessen the time that you have to spend in purgatory following your death. And there were certain strategies that could be employed. You could go on a pilgrimage, and we have examples from Ireland. I'll just go on to the next one there. We've examples from Ireland, from Tuam, where people have been buried with Pilgrim Shells. These were gotten during the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and they're worn by the person in the grave as a reminder that, hey, look, I went on pilgrimage, I can get time off in lieu in purgatory. And there's a few other examples. We have an example from Kilkenny, Mullingar as well. Same thing. Good deeds was another way to gain remission from purgatory. So almsgiving is a big one. We see it in the wills of the period. Founding an almshouse like this one here, the She Almshouse in Kilkenny, which is founded by one of the wealthiest of the late 16th, early 17th century burgesses, a man called Sir Richard She. And according to contemporary accounts of this guy, he had what was termed a long and stormy life. And when it came to him, he's thinking of his end, and he's thinking about all this purgatory stuff. He really goes to town on trying to get remission out of purgatory, because he goes into the public marketplace in Kilkenny and he repents for his sins. He locks himself away in the parish church, where he repents his sins. He makes confessions over and over and over again. He leaves gold coins for the poor of the city, and he endows this almshouse. It had an upstairs and a downstairs. The women were on the upstairs and the men were on the downstairs. It was specifically for sick and poor widows and widowers. They were allowed in there, but on the basis that no matter how sick they were, how cold it was outside, they were dragged out of their beds first thing in the morning and they're brought over to St Mary's Parish Church, which is about 200 metres away, and they're made to pray for the soul of Sir Richard on his tomb. So another way you could gain remission was you could build a bridge or a road, and basically the payback for this was that it would attract prayers for your salvation. So this is the bridge in Holy Cross, and there's a lovely plaque on it. You can see here in the photograph, and it reads in Latin, this is a translation: "To the traveller, Nicholas Cowley constructed me, Lord James Butler, Baron of Dunboyne, and his wife, Lady Margaret O'Brien, rebuilt the bridge which has fallen and ornamented it with their arms in the year of our Lord 1626. Say, I beg you, before you go away, this short prayer: may the two who built it escape the pit of hell." So again, you can see they've gone to the trouble of building this bridge, and they're asking for prayers to gain time off in purgatory. And in the same vein, donating to the church fabric or the church plate was also greatly encouraged by the church to gain remission. So you could add to the fabric, you could add to the fittings, the windows, the stained glass, and the plate, like this example here. The chalice that was donated by Walter Archer Fitzrichard to his Chantry Chapel, dedicated to St Mary in the Franciscan friary. And on the foot of the chalice, it says this in Latin: "Pray for the soul of Walter Archer Fitzrichard, 1606. And then, just in case the chantry priest should forget who it was that gave him this and who he was to pray for, at the very foot of the underside of the chalice, you can see the same thing more or less. Hello, remember me. So it was the prayers, it was all these sorts of strategies that people could put in place to gain time off in purgatory. But it's the Mass and the prayers of the living for the dead that give by far the greatest relief, and these were by far the most important. So those who could afford it, they commissioned before their deaths really elaborate tombs like these, which attracted prayers. The more masses and prayers that were said, the less time that was spent in purgatory. They had it all worked out. Tombs like this one to Walter Walsh and his wife, Elena Lawless from 1578. This is in St Mary's Parish Church in the Bryan Vault. You can see very clearly it doubles as an altar. And this enabled the priest to say Mass as close as possible to the remains. And this increased the sanctity of the Mass. And you got more time off in purgatory. And you can see this fantastic illustration from the 15th century shows you just how close to the altar the remains would have been. You can see it right underneath the, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button there, the tomb there. You've got the decayed remains. The tombs themselves are often covered in very particular Catholic religious symbolism, and these are reminders of the piety of the individual, but they're also there to attract the prayers of the passerby for the salvation of the person who's interred there. And to copper fasten this relationship, people who pray on these symbols are actually granted time off in lieu whilst they are living. They're granted indulgences for meditating on the symbols. And we even find this on some of the tombs. It's explicitly stated that, like, we have the tomb here of James Shortall. He's the Lord of Ballylarkin in County Kilkenny, and his wife Catherine. He dies in 1534 in St Canice's Cathedral. And the inscription, again, it's in black letter Latin, but it records, it includes for an indulgence of 80 days is granted to everyone who says the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary for their souls and the souls of their parents. So you can see just this whole infrastructure around the doctrine of purgatory is developing throughout the medieval and the late medieval period. The main reason for this was because the ultimate terror was to be forgotten by your family, and no prayers are being said, no masses are being said, to be forgotten by your community, and you're forever trapped in purgatory as a result. And in some cases, people, I believe, they went so far as to commission tombs that actually showed their rotting corpses, like these are the so-called Cadaver Tombs. Various theories about them, but it's pretty clear to me, I think, that their primary intended purpose is to elicit sympathy for the deceased and thereby attract prayers. And this is the James Rice, a fantastic scan, one of these fancy model scans of the James Rice tomb, Cadaver tomb in Waterford Cathedral. It's set up in his own Chantry Chapel, which he dedicated to St. James, and he died in 1487. And you can see his remains. Here he's shown as a corpse, and there's even a little frog here eating away at his belly, and he's in his shroud. It's an absolutely wonderful piece of macabre medieval sculpture. But the inscription around the side of the tomb just tells you everything that you need to know about what message he was trying to convey here. And it says, "You who stand here consider that what I am, you will be. I was what you are. I beg you pray for me that when it is your fate to pass through the gate of death, our Christ who has come to redeem the lost, lest he be redeemed by the damned, will have pity." So you can see very clearly there, Rice is saying, pray for me, look at me, I need you. So these are the sort of extraordinary lengths that are gone to ensure that the soul is remembered and to ensure prayers and masses are being said. Now, if you're at the top of the tree and you're a member of the nobility at the time, you can build a big, grand Collegio chapel like St Mary's in Goran here in County Kilkenny. And one of the main purposes of buildings like these was to have basically teams of chantry priests that did very little else but continuously pump out thousands and thousands of beneficial masses for the soul of the benefactor. And in this case, it's Edmund Butler and his wife Joan. And for other wealthy patrons, they had just slightly down the pecking order. They could build a Chantry Chapel in a parish church or an abbey or a cathedral like this. I'm quite certain Ferns Cathedral would have had many of these chapels in it in its heyday. And this is an example here of a relatively intact one in Winchester Cathedral. It's the Bishop Fox Chantry from the 15th century. And you can see it's elaborate, very, very typical, very fine screen, a thing called a parclose screen, which screens it off from the rest of the church. And inside that, there's monuments that are arranged around the walls. The centerpiece would have been the monument of the benefactor. And inside chapels like this, a priest is then endowed to chant, which is where the word chantry comes from. So to sing a set number of masses for the soul of the benefactor. And generally these are stipulated in the will of the deceased, and they can run into literally thousands and thousands. We have a fellow over in Long Melford, John Clopton, and he pays for 2,000 masses to be said for his soul within a month of his death. So some poor chantry priest had to do little else for an entire month but say mass after mass after mass for Mr. Clopton. Now, with the Reformation, and particularly with this fella here, Edward VI, what was termed the vain and superstitious devotional tradition of purgatory, it's outlawed. And this really profoundly impacted on that relationship that the living had with the dead. It broke the thread that bound the living to the dead, because basically the dead were now stranded. The living could no longer help the dead. And this was one of the fundamental changes that the Protestant Reformation brought about. Edward VI, 1547 Chantry Act that dissolves the chantries in England, Wales and Scotland. However, it did not apply to Ireland, and this is really, really important. And that's why we find that the institutions, they continue in many of the parish churches. And it seems that as the monasteries, which are dissolved, are emptied then of their chantries, a lot of them are pouring into the remaining churches, like the parish churches, and in some cases the cathedrals as well. And we're finding this well into the 1600s. It's the 18th century, it's the Georgians and the Victorians really that do away with most of the fabric of the Irish Chantry Chapels. And today there's very, very little remaining of any of them. In fact, Callan Parish Church here in Kilkenny again represents a pretty typical enough scene in that you have a whole series of Chantry Chapels that would have been in the nave aisles here. And all you've got left, you've got a tomb, and there's a few little sockets that you can see in the nave aisle pillars here, the columns where those screens would have slotted into them. Sometimes they may have been in timber or in stone, like we saw earlier on. So it was really, really fortunate, I suppose, from my point of view as somebody who has been interested in this whole horizon of Irish archaeology to do with purgatory and the chantry movement, and that I had this opportunity in 2015 and 2016 to excavate in St Mary's Parish Church, where we knew there was a whole series of these chantry chapels that had survived well into the 1600s. They've been well documented in the merchant wills of the town and so forth. So St. Mary's itself, here's a lovely aerial photograph of it here. There's the church, and you can see it's situated just below Kilkenny Castle. And inside of the walled town, it's the parish church for St. Mary's, which is this yellow bit of the walled town and just slightly outside the walls as well. So it's basically the parish church for the English town, and that's what it was called before anybody starts shouting at me. The English town of Kilkenny. The church is built by William Marshall around, hard to put a definite date on it, but it's certainly there is definitely a church there by 1205, and I would suggest that it was begun in 1200 when himself and Isabel de Clare, his wife, visited Kilkenny. And it's built specifically for the Anglo-Norman community of what he made as basically the capital of his Leinster lordship. Its medieval plan we can reconstruct as follows. You've got, Tig was referring to these earlier on, big long chancel, very wide open nave, north transept, south transept, and then there's a porch on the north and a porch on the south. And in 1344, a tower is added to the northwest corner. So it's a very, very substantial church. It's hard to work it out, but it's probably second in size to St. Mary's Parish Church in New Ross, which seems to be the largest of Ireland's medieval parish churches. Now, at the Reformation, St. Mary's, it passes to the established church, and it remains Protestant apart from during the Confederation of Kilkenny between 1641 and 1650, right up until the 1950s, in fact, and it's deconsecrated. And at this time, at the Reformation, something really interesting happens here, because the church is divided between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Protestants have the nave and the crossing, and probably a little bit of the chancel here as well. We're not quite clear about that. And then the Catholics have the rest of it. So the Catholics have the north transept, this bit of the chancel here, and the south transept, and so forth, and possibly some of the Lady Chapel here as well. And we see at the Reformation that there's at least 9 chapels established by the Old English Catholic merchant families. These are mainly of the She, Roth and Archer, the triumvirate who basically controlled the town at the time. And we know of 9 of these chapels, but there was probably an awful lot more of them which have gone undocumented. This plan just shows you where we know some of these chapels were. So you've got the John Roth Chantry up here, you've another Roth Chantry beside it, and so forth. And we'll show you a little bit about those in a minute. Now, when you look at the church today, a bit like where we are at the moment, there's very, very little of the original medieval fabric surviving. You can see the black is the 13th century fabric. And the rest of it then is, you can see the blue, and so it's all 18th, 19th century rebuilding. And these are the areas that we excavated inside the church. You can see we excavated about 70% of the original medieval interior, and then all these areas outside, and it was just an absolutely phenomenal experience, I have to say. I don't think there's been an excavation on this scale done on any urban parish church before, so What we had to do was excavate to a depth of about 1 metre inside the church, and this was to facilitate underground services and that kind of thing. And the most important thing was that when the church was demolished in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, what they basically did was they got all the rubble and they chucked it all back into the interior of the church. And this raised up the ground level by about 1 metre. But from our point of view, the great thing about that was that it preserved all the medieval levels relatively intact underneath them. So our main job then was to remove all of that rubble from the interior. And we'll just very quickly run through some of the main discoveries that we made. If we look at the North Transept first, this is the Roth Chantry Chapel dedicated to St. Michael of the Archangel. It's founded by the Roth family in about 1550. And beneath 1 metre of the infill, 3 absolutely beautiful 16th century carved altar tombs were discovered against the north wall. If we look at it in plan, there you just a very quick plan. There's your 3 tombs against the north wall. Whole series of burials here. A great big vault underneath, a lovely paved predella here, and then an effigy down at the bottom. You can just see quickly some of the beautiful carving on the altar tombs. That's a scan of the cover of one of the tombs. It's the one in the northeast corner. And you can see, because they've been covered over, every little chisel mark is perfectly visible. And these are the work, we know from the style of these, that these are the work of the O'Tunney master sculptures from 16th century Kilkenny. On the west side of the chapel, this thing is a predella. It's like an altar step, and you can see some of the sockets there for some of the candles that would have lit the altar. And underneath, that is the main burial vault for the Roths. On top of the predella, this tomb was placed in 1637. This is Richard Roth. And when we were excavating just in this area here, we got a big surprise, because this turned up, which is a gun, a rifle it was stashed there probably during the Revolutionary period. And then in the south side of the chapel, south side of the north transept, so this started to appear, which was absolutely wonderful. And there's me, very, very happy, because it just dawned on me that we're after finding an absolutely beautiful 14th century double effigy. It's a real work of art in its own right. We have no inscription on the effigy, unfortunately, but we would hazard a guess that it might have been somebody to do with the Roth family. And it's incorporated into their chantry in the 16th century. The double effigy itself covered an oval plaster grave, and we only investigated the top burial inside it, which was a post-medieval burial, probably an 18th century burial, so it seems that it had been moved out, a burial placed in, and then moved back again. The walls of the chapel itself, we know from these tiles that were strewn around it, these are Portuguese patterned or azuelo wall tiles, would have looked something like this, which is quite amazing, really. This is the church in the castle of Óbidos in Lisbon. So beautiful, beautiful. And then The floor was tiled with lovely tiles from Normandy, and this is the only place in Ireland that these tiles have been found thus far. So it's just giving you really an insight into the wealth of these guys, that they were able to import all this really, really high-end material to decorate their chantry chapels. We go below ground level into the burial vaults, and the entire church was basically a honeycomb of these burial vaults. We entered the vault, went down the steps, and this is what met our eyes, a stack of timber coffins, which continued for at least a metre below ground level. Now, we didn't excavate in here, we left everything in situ, but there's presumably earlier rotes underneath. The very, very top coffin luckily had a date on it of 1714. You can just see the 17, and there's an initial here. There's just a close-up of it. So it's C, and then there's an R on the other timber there. So it's CR 1714, and we know that this is a woman called Catherine Roth, and she dies in 1714. We actually have a chalice belonging to her that she endowed. The coffin itself, really, really fine in its own right. You can see long, narrow coffin, very finely decorated with all this stud work and iron fittings. And Catherine herself was buried in her burial shroud, which had a lovely pink ribbon in the sign of the cross down along her midriff. And if you can just make that out there, can you see that? Sign of the cross there, that still survived. So that's the Roth Chapel. Back down into the south transept, we excavated in the Archer family chapel. This was dedicated to St. James. And beneath the paved flues of the Victorian heating system, which was again above all of this dumped debris, a lovely stone altar tomb to Walter Archer. And he's the first MP for Kilkenny, who dies in 1575. His wife, Joanna Hackett. Again, loads and loads of burial vaults in the south transept, and you can see them opening up from the ground level here. The steps down here, more Archer burial vaults here. We know that there was a fellow called Thomas Archer buried here. And in fact, we got his shoes, his burial shoes. So if we go down into this burial vault, down the steps again, and you can see this one full of human bone. And this one had been treated with lime. The coffins had been broken open, and then a load of lime thrown in on top of them. This is to speed up the decomposition of the corpses, because you can imagine that when you have a church like this and it's full of burial vaults with the dead decaying underneath, the smell must have been absolutely intolerable. And this was one way that they dealt with it at the time. Just very quickly then into the John Roth Chantry Chapel, which was built just outside the north transept. John Roth, he's famous as the builder of Roth House in Kilkenny in 1594, still survives today. And in 1612, he has a chantry chapel built. And we find in his will, which was written 7 years later, that he has this fear of the afterlife again. And he says, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I, John Roth Fitzpiers, of the city of Kilkenny, alderman, being in perfect health and memory, considering the frailty of man's life, and yet nothing is more certain than death, nor more uncertain. And I do will that my body be buried in my chantry chapel, lately erected by myself at St. Mary's." And in fact, John Roth Fitzpiers' chantry chapel is the very last of them the chantries to have been built at St Mary's in 1612. Again, it's destroyed during the 18th century demolitions, but when we excavated there, we found the setting for his tomb here, a setting for an altar on the east side, and this lovely paved floor again, and a whole series of stone-lined graves, presumably full of roths. Here's his tomb, which was moved out of his chantry in 1820. And that's the setting here for his tomb. And you can see the nice paving I was talking about. There's excavations underway in one of the stone-lined graves. There's Philly. And this one was particularly interesting in that there was 3 burials that had been placed one on top of each other. And you notice that the heads are at the east side of the grave, which is quite unusual. And it suggests that maybe these were priests or ecclesiastics of some description. There were 3 old males as well. And what's even more interesting about them is that we got the bottom one and the top one radiocarbon dated, and we expected them all to be, to do with the John Roth Chantry Chapel, so they had to post-date 1612. But in fact, the bottom one dates from the 15th century, and the top one dates nicely from the 17th century, okay. So why is there a 15th century burial in this particular grave? Was it somebody whose coffin was moved into here when the chapel was established in 1612? It's a bit of a puzzle. We uncovered about 4,000 artifacts, and many of these came from the Chantry Chapels. Loads and loads of coffin furniture from the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries in particular, like these handles and breastplates and so forth. Loads of these little studs, they're the things that made up the initials on the Catherine Roth tomb. Some of them very nicely decorated. Religious medals, Catholic Counter-Reformation religious medals like this one from the 17th century. This is taken back from a pilgrimage to Rome. Same with this one. Marian medal. There's one of our Pilgrim Shells. And lots of personal objects, cufflinks and buttons and finger rings, coins, political tokens that are reused as pendants, beautiful little stud buttons like these, lovely brooch from the 19th century, loads of coins, 90 coins were retrieved, all metal detected, everything, and it proved to be very, very successful. Fixtures and fittings from the church itself, lots of lead cames and stained glass from the 13th century windows, keys, there's a medieval key in the middle there. The church was used as a magazine in the late 17th century during the Williamite Wars, and evidence of that in a cache of these lead weights as well. The marketplace of the medieval town spread into the churchyard on occasion, and lots of these lead weights were found. Some very strange objects as well, like this is a little pendant, seems to have been cut off a copper alloy sheet that had a depiction of a battleship on it. And can you make that out there? There's a cannon on the prow of a ship, and the cannon is firing out here. And then this little fella, little ledge soldier from the early 1900s, lost by some poor little fella who was probably bored out of his mind at Mass. 300 carved stones, many of them from the medieval phase of the church, but the vast majority of them were derived from funerary monuments. Just like this is a side panel of a 16th century altar tomb. So all of this we're in the process of preparing this now for a pretty major publication, and in the meantime, as Dennis mentioned, if any of you want to see these archaeological discoveries, you can see them at the new Medieval Mile Museum, as it was called. It was officially opened in April 2 years ago, and that's what it looks like from the outside, and that's what it looks like from the inside. So there's an exhibition of our artifacts here, and you can see the double effigy up here and so forth inside. Just to finish, I think it's important to say that what these excavations have offered us is it's a really important and a unique insight into post-Reformation chantry chapels. I think what we're seeing is an archaeology of some of the very, very last operating Catholic chantry chapels in Europe, indeed. And it's the final act of the once great and widespread chantry movement. And it's what was basically a vital and profoundly important relationship between the living and the dead. So, thank you.